The Impossibility of Life by Natural Forces and Random Chance. Can life come from non-life? Life has always been observed to come from life. That's the law of biogenesis that goes back to Louis Pasteur, using his microscope. Evolution requires faith that a single reproducing cell formed at least once from natural, unguided processes. After all, we had to get here somehow. The Miller-Urey experiment, 1953. This is still lauded in textbooks and taught as an experiment that produced amino acids, the building blocks of protein, sometimes extrapolated to the building blocks of life. Now, Miller proposed a group of primordial chemicals, an atmosphere, initial conditions where life began. Now, he took that chemical mixture, added electricity, and it produced amino acids which were immediately captured. Now, this was celebrated as a great success to this day. It showed how nature could have produced the building blocks of life. It's never really been improved or extended. There have been other sort of parallel aspects to it, different primordial conditions, different energy sources than electricity stimulating a lightning strike. But it's not like anybody's found a way to produce life or get really any closer to it. Now, the limitations of Miller-Urey. No one believes Miller-Urey's experimental atmosphere ever existed. Now, evidence points to the fact that the Earth has always had oxygen in the atmosphere. Miller's proposal did not. Earth's oldest rocks contain evidence of being formed in an oxygen atmosphere. Oxygen, very significant. The mixture was actually toxic. Miller's mixture, it was toxic to the amino acids being produced. They had to be removed immediately, or they would be immediately disassembled, destroyed. And again, Miller did not allow for an oxygen atmosphere. So the question is, did this intelligently designed experiment prove life came into being on its own without intelligent design? Now, why did Miller-Urey exclude oxygen? Oxygen destroys organic molecules. It breaks apart amino acid bonds. Oxygen is severely lethal to organisms that have no established protections against it. So, for an organism to live in an oxygen environment, it has to have some defense mechanism against that environment. But how does it live to develop such a thing? If it's in the oxygen environment, it would have to be there somehow in the very initial cell, which seems extraordinarily unlikely. An oxygen-free atmosphere was a necessary assumption for Miller-Urey because he understood these properties of oxygen. However, if there were no oxygen, there would have been no ozone layer to protect life from deadly ultraviolet radiation. So if you don't have killer oxygen in the mix, you're going to have killer ultraviolet radiation in the mix. Could life have formed in water, protected from the air? See, water is also deadly to organic molecules. Deadly oxygen, deadly ultraviolet radiation, deadly water. It comes at you at every turn. Hydrolysis is a chemical reaction in which water breaks chemical bonds. And any proposed early organic molecules would be susceptible to this. Now, What if we had a ready source of amino acids? We accepted Miller-Urey or something better, and all the amino acids we ever wanted just came falling into our laps. Well, amino acids come in two forms, left-handed and right-handed, even if they are otherwise identical. This is called chirality. Even a small protein has a string of about 100 amino acids. Any proposed conditions that might produce amino acids and somehow preserve them, we've talked about the problems with that, any proposed conditions would produce roughly even amounts of left and right-handed acids. In fact, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Life only contains left-handed amino acids. Mixing in right-handed acids would be toxic to life. But the thing is, when an organism dies, it immediately begins breaking down into both right and left-handed amino acids. Again, any recipe for producing the building blocks of life also destroys them. Water, oxygen, non-oxygen, and a mix of right-handed and left-handed amino acids. So even if Miller and Urey were there to pluck out a protein, if it formed accidentally, would that ever happen? An average protein has 300 left-handed amino acids. A small protein has 100 left-handed amino acids. Imagine flipping a coin 100 times and always coming up heads. The odds are 1 in 2 to the 100th power, or 1.2 times 10 to the 30th. That's just for one small protein to form. A necessary string of amino acids to form. And then you'd have to pluck it out to use it. Now, it is evolution that requires impossible faith. Walter Bradley, PhD in material science, and Charles Thaxton, PhD in chemistry, calculated that the probability of amino acids forming into a protein is 1 in 4.9 times 10 to the 191st power. See, they're calculating beyond just the chirality problem. Now, according to the laws of probability, if the chance of an event occurring is smaller than 1 in 10 to the 50th power, then the event will never occur. That has something to do with the speed of light and some other things, where they come up with that number. But adding ever more time to the equation does not solve the problem. And this is just for forming a protein. And a protein is not even close to the complexity of a living cell. A living cell has been compared to an efficiently run city. It has been compared to a high-tech factory with molecular machines run by a supercomputer. And the more we learn about the complexity of life, the more absurd a random origin seems. Darwin, by the way, had no knowledge or concepts of these microscopic complexities, which, the closer we look, the deeper we look, the more complicated and impressive the cell gets. It's just a little diagram to the right of a basic cell. And it's very complicated, and it is very, very productive. A very productive system. A single cell. Now again, belief in life arising through natural processes requires astounding faith. Sir Fred Hoyle, PhD in astronomy, and Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor of applied mathematics and astronomy, calculated that the probability of getting a cell by naturalistic processes, unguided but random chance, natural forces at work, would be 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Now, the estimated number of atoms in the observable universe is only 10 to the 80th power. These are beyond this is beyond an astronomical number by a lot. A matter of perspective. Dr. Fred Hoyle again. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable to the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Dr. Edwin Conklin, biologist and zoologist, he said the probability of life originating from accident is comparable to the probability of the unabridged dictionary resulting from an explosion in a printing shop. Now that goes back to the pre-laser printer days when type was made from little letters put in the right order to press onto a piece of paper. Imagine a room full of letters exploding and landing in the order of the unabridged dictionary. Imagine them landing in the order of the Declaration of Independence, a single page, even excluding spacing and punctuation and capitalization. It's just not going to happen. One mistake and it's gone. And another thing to keep in mind, even if you have some sort of primordial conditions and they're struck by lightning and out pops Tom Cruise, that is actually irrelevant to evolution because Tom has no way of reproducing himself. As complex as he is, he cannot reproduce himself. Another dimension of cell complexity, DNA. DNA is in most every cell in your body. It contains information to build you. DNA molecules, called nucleotides, are combined into codes storing vast amounts of information. Codes for producing over 100,000 proteins. A single DNA molecule contains 500,000 to 1 million book pages of information. That's a small library. Now, and that number is probably growing because we're finding there's so many different ways to read the DNA in different directions, and both directions have completely distinct and useful and active purposes. So the information actually seems to be increasing what we're finding in the DNA. DNA is a language. 4 nucleotides are combined into codes for 20 chemicals known as amino acids. Amino acids are then built into proteins. In the picture we see on the left 3 Morse code symbols, dots, dashes, and spaces, can make up 26 letters, which can form the approximately 400,000 words of the English language. And of course, they could be applied to other languages as well. Now, the 4 nucleotides of DNA can form 20 amino acids, which can form over 100,000 proteins that are used in living organisms. DNA storage capacity. 1 pinhead of DNA could hold enough information to fill a stack of books stretching from the Earth to the Moon 500 times. A single strand of DNA is thousands of times thinner than a strand of human hair. Again, requires a lot of faith to believe that was assembled without intelligent design. Information can only come from an intelligent source. Information cannot arise from natural processes. There's no known mechanism for that. All information comes from an intelligent source. If the SETI project, you see the satellite dishes at the right, radio telescopes actually, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project, if they received a code from outer space with the code from a strand of DNA, it would magnificently pass as absolute proof of intelligence. See, they analyze the signals they get looking for complex forms that indicate intelligence. DNA would overwhelm their test. The code from that, they would say this had to be intelligently created. It could not be natural. Now, where did all that information come from? Proteins are amazingly versatile and carry out many biochemical functions. Information in DNA is required to make proteins. We've said this already. Each of the thousands of genes on a DNA molecule contains instructions necessary to make a specific protein that in turn is needed for a specific biological function. And that's even a simplified statement there. Proteins manufactured with information from DNA are required to read DNA. Get that? The DNA produces proteins. Those proteins are needed to read DNA. But before DNA could produce anything, it had to have proteins to read the DNA. So which came first, the protein to read DNA or the DNA to produce protein? There's no simple beginning for life. So how is information added to the DNA code? Suppose random processes beat all truly impossible odds and produce a living, reproducing cell. For that cell to evolve into you would require vast additional amounts of information. Human DNA codes for you. In every cell of your body, virtually, you have all the information needed to build your skin, your skeletal system, your circulatory system, your digestive system, all the different systems and organs and structures of your body. It's all there in every strand of DNA, in every cell of your body. And that is a huge amount of information. It's much more information than what is needed for a single cell, even though that is an extraordinary amount of information. Now, genetic mutations never add information to the DNA code. Mutations are changes in the genetic code. Genes are a subsection of DNA code. Mutations are caused by radiation, some chemicals, some viruses, and copying errors when DNA is replicating. Mutations do not produce new information. That has never been observed. No known mechanism or process exists to produce new genetic information that adds to the genome. Mutations only corrupt and destroy information. Now, most mutations are harmless, but combined mutations are usually necessary for harm. That's why it's more important than ever not to marry and reproduce with close relatives. If you are marrying someone you're not related to, if you have a mutation, chances are they don't have that same mutation, and their good gene will cover up the faulty gene in you, and vice versa. But two closely related people might have, or more likely to have, the same defects, and if those defects combine, you're more likely to see problems in the offspring. So this is a downhill process, a process that degrades. This is not a process that builds up. Evolution works on natural selection. There are attempts to come up with other possibilities, but nobody's really come up with anything. The problem is selection can only be applied to existing genetic information. Most of the variations in populations arise from reshuffling of previously existing genes, not from mutations. If evolution could explain the tremendous variety of genetic information in all life forms, information adding mutations should be readily observable, but not one has ever been observed. Now, what about so-called beneficial mutations? They involve lost, lessened, or damaged capabilities. They're only beneficial under certain environmental circumstances. One example is sickle cell anemia. It's often noted in Africa. It can be beneficial to life, but that is because of the prevalence of deadly malaria. The sickle cell on the right, the red blood cells are produced abnormally, and they don't carry oxygen as efficiently, but they also don't carry malaria very well. So people with sickle cell usually don't get malaria and die from malaria. That can actually give them an advantage over the rest of the population around them. But here in America, in the West, what do we call sickle cell anemia? We call it a disease because it is hazardous. It is detrimental to health. Even people with the mildest forms of sickle cell anemia have to be very careful about overexertion, or they will end up in the hospital or worse. And worse forms, more severe forms of sickle cell anemia, people don't tend to live very long. Now, an observation from a non-creationist information theorist, Hubert Yockey. Research on the origin of life seems to be unique in that the conclusion has already been authoritatively accepted. Got that? The conclusion comes first. What remains to be done is to find the scenarios which describe the detailed mechanisms and processes by which this happened. One must conclude that, contrary to the established and current wisdom, a scenario describing the genesis of life on Earth by chance and natural causes, which can be accepted on the basis of fact and not faith, has not yet been written. I have an additional resource here, a link to an article or the QR code. Uh, DNA, Marvelous Messages or Mostly Mess by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. It's an excellent article. I recommend it. And also, this is a link to uh, a book. It says new up there. It's actually a few years old now. Originally did this presentation um, in a translated form for a closed country. And at the time I did it, this book was brand new. But it sounds very interesting, and the review of it is at the right. The book is Stairway to Life, an Origin of Life reality check. Thank you very much for listening.